our Q&A, and then we will go on to our usual little meeting that we'll have. And I want to introduce Mark Hall. He's an OLLI instructor, which is Osher Lifelong Learning at Duke. And I've become friends with him, a student instructor friendship. And I've invited him here, and we could go the next slide. About Mark Hall. Uh, how would you characterize the typical North Carolina prisons? Have you wondered how you could help people in prison? Do you want to better understand the prison system? Mark Hall knows all these issues because he has served, and he will go into that situation during his talk. And the next slide, please. Mark served time in a variety of correctional facilities in North Carolina. He learned from fellow prisoners about addiction, homelessness, and other issues in their lives. And Mark completed his probation in July of 2020. And his topic will be My Prison Journey. And his website and his organization is Faceless No More. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark, and I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And it has been a joy and just your encouragement and support of the programs that we started since my release last October. But I want to share a little bit with you about my Rotary experience. I was in Rotary for a couple of decades. I was a member of the Central Johnston Rotary Club, which is in the same district as your club. And when I heard Veronica read the four-way test, that was something that I got absolutely wrong. We should ask these questions in all things that we're doing. Oftentimes it may be something little or something simple. We should ask ourselves that, but we should also ask ourselves the same thing when we're addressing the major issues of our country and of our community as well. And we've got to be able to see through others' eyes and not just our own. And sometimes when we do that, we have a better pathway to meeting the four-way test goals and all. But yes, I had a wonderful Rotary experience. I actually served as a president in 2000, I believe it was 2006, and went to Rotary conferences and enjoyed it. And I admire the work they've done, and particularly with Polio Plus, and what an incredible eradication. And hopefully that's what we'll see with the coronavirus in the next year or two. But I want to share with you a little bit about my life prior to my 10-year prison journey. My life, it resembled a perfect picture. It may be something, and you may refer to it as a Norman Rockwell painting. I had a wonderful career. I spent over 20 years in the financial services industry. I had a wonderful family, a marriage of 27 years when I did get into trouble. I'm happy to say now that marriage, we will celebrate 39 years this December, and that marriage is stronger than ever before. And quite frankly, if I had continued on that journey, I probably would have lost that marriage as well as the support network that I had in place. But my life, it looked picture perfect. I had two grown children. I was able to walk my daughter down the aisle for her marriage. I was able to see both my children graduate from college. I was able to develop wonderful networks and lasting friendships with people. And one of the things I found on this prison journey was that many of the people that I was incarcerated with, many of the men that I was incarcerated with, never had that opportunity. Yes, I was older than most, but there was a lack of resources, a lack of maybe one more relationship that they could have reached out to. But my life appeared to be picture perfect. But then in 2007 and 2008, I crossed the line. And it was, if some of y'all remember, and this isn't an excuse, it's just the facts of the time. It was in the midst of the financial crisis. I was the CEO of a small prestigious firm. We were correspondents for JP Morgan, and Many of our partner organizations, how many of y'all remember the name Bear Stearns or Wachovia Bank? We thought they would be around forever and ever, but they folded during that time. And as I said, this is by no means an excuse, but there was a lot of ugliness and just a lot of turmoil that was happening around us. And I didn't approach it the right way. And I knew right from wrong. Knowing right from wrong is very easy. It's like the lights are off, the lights are on. It's a very defined line. But I crossed the line originally into that almost right area. And oftentimes when I speak with business groups and all, I talk about sometimes the destructive path they go down to is that small slice that we try to put in our mind and justify as almost right. But once we get in that almost right category, it becomes easy to definitely cross over to the wrong. And my crime was a financial crime. The first transaction that showed me that I could move a client's money into a company account or a personal account was a mistake. It was a clerical mistake. It was something that I processed incorrectly. But I felt that it would be too embarrassing and too tough to go back and try to correct this because there'd be so many compliance issues and regulatory issues. I would just let it sit until I could figure it out. And what happened is I got comfortable with it. I got very comfortable with that money, not very comfortable, but got more comfortable with that money sitting there. And over the course of a couple of years, during this crazy time in the financial market. And as I said, that's not an excuse. It's just the reality of it. I got more and more comfortable, and before I knew it, I had moved about $4 million of clients' monies into accounts. That was to benefit myself as well as my firm. So I crossed that line, and it could have been taken care of much easier. Yes, it would have been embarrassing, but it would never have been as destructive as facing up to it and clearing it up at that time. But I became a criminal. I crossed that line and did that. And that was in 2008. And then in early spring of 2008 and 7, the early spring of 2009, I received a phone call from a client's CPA. And this client was a mutual client of both of ours. And he had some questions, and he was just starting to investigate or dig a little bit. That was the beginning of a long, hot summer. That was 2009. And I'll never forget, he was continuing to work and continuing to dig and ask me for more letters and more verifications. And I would send him some things. And many of those were fictitious statements that I would send. And I thought that would be enough to quiet him down. But I knew it was getting very, very stressful. And I'll never forget, my daughter was married on June 20th. And I remember getting ready for her wedding that morning and dressing in the dressing room there and putting my tie on and thinking if the crowd was gathering. It was held at this beautiful Southern style estate, and friends and family were gathering, and I was getting ready to walk my daughter down the aisle. And I often thought that if they only knew what I had done and what may be coming down the track, in the near future. And anyhow, that was a long, difficult summer. And then on the morning of August the 9th, it was a Thursday morning, 2020. I'll never forget it. I was at a coffee shop across the street from my office, which was right next door to the courthouse in downtown Smithfield. I got up and walked out my door, and I saw the two men, what I referred to as the two men in dark suits, standing by my front door waiting to greet me. And we all know, especially y'all from Eastern North Carolina, that in the middle of August, when you have men in dark suits standing by your office door, it's one of two things. It's either an undertaker or an attorney. You know it's not going to be a good day. And I went and I welcomed them in. I knew what they were there for. And we sat down at my office table. I had a round conference table in my office, and I put it on the table. And that was the moment that I started to try to clean up the mess that I had created. And I will never forget that in my discovery, my court discovery, one of those men in dark suits had an entry in there that it felt as if a burden was lifted from Mark Hall. And yes, there was a complete burden that was lifted, but it was also a complete sense of hopelessness. It was complete hopelessness. And I didn't feel as if maybe life was worth even going on. But now, 11 years later, I'm grateful to say that life did go on in much better and enriching ways, even during my time of incarceration. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I put it on the table August the 9th, like I said, 2020, 20th. I had never had a criminal attorney, so an attorney friend of mine recommended somebody as a criminal attorney, and she came to see me. And I'll never forget her talking to me and saying, "Mr. Hall, crimes like this may take a year or two before you're indicted." And I'm thankful to say that she was wrong in that case. It was 6 weeks later I was indicted. And I say I'm thankful now because it would have just drug out the whole process. I was the only one involved with my crime. It was better to put it on the table and start addressing these issues and find out how to get to the other side in the best way I could. But 6 weeks later, I was called. I got a phone call from the attorney. She said I needed to report to the courthouse or there would be an arrest warrant out on me and within the next hour. So I went to the courthouse. My wife and I went, and I turned myself in, and that began my prison journey, my journey with incarceration. And I refer to it as my tour of some of the most secure gated communities in the state of North Carolina. And I went through different prisons and things, and I'll share about that. And that's what I want to share with y'all today, and about some of the discoveries I made at each one of those points, which was primarily 4 different points, because I was arrested at the county courthouse, and I ended up spending the next 20 months there, almost 2 years, in our county courthouse awaiting sentencing. And one of the things I thought about, that courthouse was right next door to my office. I spent 20 months less than 40 yards from where I sat in my office chair and committed these crimes. But more importantly, I thought back within a couple of weeks of being in there, I thought back to those mornings at the coffee shop when I would meet with 10 or 12 people every morning. We would meet from 7 to 8 o'clock, and we'd have coffee, and it was folks from different parts of the community. There was actually the former police chief, the future mayor. There were business owners, civil servants, just a collection of people. And boy, did we think we knew everything in the world that went on in Johnston and Wake counties. We had a handle on business. We had a handle on politics. We had a handle on real estate. But let me tell you, it's not until you spend those almost 2 years under your county courthouse that you really learn about what's going on in your community. And that came back to haunt me so often. And it was in that time in the courthouse that I learned so much about our community. I learned about, several things. Addiction. I learned about the grip that addiction has on our community. And addiction crosses all colors of our community and all segments. There's no void there. And I learned about how oftentimes somebody's addictive behavior, once they lost those resources of maybe getting the prescription medicine correctly, the right way, turned to criminal behavior to support their habits. I learned about some of the actions. I'll never forget meeting a young man named Matthew. And Matthew was probably in his late 20s, sharp-looking guy. He lived here in town in North Smithfield, and he was in there on murder. And he murdered a lady that I knew. There was a lady who walked the town every morning. She'd walk by my office and she'd tap on the door on the window, and she'd wave to me because she'd walk her dog. She was a wife of a town attorney. And I'll never forget sitting there talking to Matthew, and we would talk baseball and things a lot. And it was the first time I was able to put faces behind these stories. We read a story about a horrific crime or this happening, or crimes in over-policed neighborhoods and things. I would learn about, we would hear about these sensational crimes, but we didn't know the face. We didn't know the person behind it. But I got to know that person, and then I also knew the victim of that. So that was incredibly educating. The homelessness that reaches our communities, even in a community like most of us live in, probably. I learned about the men who, particularly because I was there through 2 winter seasons, I would learn about the men who would, and women who would maybe commit a small crime, a misdemeanor crime, to get into the system, So oftentimes, homelessness and addiction, or mental health issues and homelessness, people feel they have to do something to get into the system to maybe get some help. And quite frankly, the help they're going to get in the system isn't all that strong. So I learned about that. I learned about the court systems and the plea deals and how our courts are actually being used and the cases are being cleared. And one of the things I learned about this plea bargaining, most of us, we had our criminal justice learning from watching episodes of Law and Order. We thought everything was put together in a nice, neat package, and it was usually over very, very quickly. But it's not. It's these plea deals that are offered, and the representation that oftentimes many of the men and women have that are sitting in our county jails. And this isn't to be a detriment to a public appointed defender. They have a very tough job. They have a very tough job. They're very overworked. Their caseload is incredible. I was surprised to hear about the men that when they walked into the courtroom was the first time they ever met their attorney. They never had a chance to share that story. And I also learned something, and this is that who has the real power in adjudication, who has the real power in addressing that sentence, whether it be a misdemeanor event or a felony event. The power really falls in the district attorney's hands. And a lot of that is due to structured sentencing. And that's a topic for another day. But quite frankly, that judge, a lot of his discretion is gone because of structured sentencing, which came about in North Carolina in the mid-90s after the Get Tough on Crime stance came out. A judge, basically, he has a chart and he looks across the top. How much trouble have you been in the past? What class of crime has a DA assigned to it? And you have a box. You have a box that you have to stay within to give out the sentence. So there's very little discretion that's allowed there. And then one of the other discoveries I learned there, which was among many, but I had to pick just a few bullet points. One was what we're locking people up for, what we are placing people into our county jails for. And oftentimes the ones we're locking up are not a danger to themselves or a danger to their community, and things could be addressed differently. Our bond system, our bail system is so far way out of control. But I was there for those 20 months. And then I was sentenced in May of 2011. I was sentenced to 10 to 13 and a half years. And that fell right within the structured sentencing grid of what that judge had, based on the attorney saying that Mark Hall had these charges of embezzlement, and based on the amount of it, it was what was referred to as a Class C, with A being the most serious, and dropping all the way down to H and further down with the least serious crime. We knew I was going to have some prison time, and I'm thankful that all those days that I spent in the county jail, while it didn't reduce my sentence, because a judge had to stay with that structure of sentencing, every one of those days helped to reduce, it went toward that time. So I had 10 years given to me minimum, 120 months. And I was thankful when I finally arrived at Central Prison, even though it was a hard dose to swallow. But when my case manager said, "Mr. Hall, you have 100 months left," I thought it was insurmountable. But I was thankful for those 20 months that I spent in the county jail. But I was sentenced, as I said, in May. And the very next morning, I was put in the back of a sheriff's car, and I was rushed very quickly to Central Prison in downtown Raleigh. And Central Prison is a maximum security prison. Some people will say, "Well, why did you go there? Your crime wasn't a violent crime and all." But in North Carolina, if you have 10 years or more, you go through processing at Central Prison. And so I went there for processing, which normally takes about 2 weeks. But like so often happens in the prison system, my situation got lost in the cracks, and I was there for 4 months. And I'm thankful now to say, for those 4 months, I was able to learn a lot of things that I'm able to use now. And there's sights and sounds at Central Prison I'll never forget. Some of the sights and sounds it's almost like living in a parking deck. It's all concrete and it's all gray, and it's not very exciting. And everybody has their own parking spot or their own cell. And I had my own cell. And it was controlled movement, meaning you were able to get out for 1 hour a day and then twice a week for 2 hours for recreation. But there's sights and sounds I never forget was when they first gave me my prison clothes and they sent me on my way from the first stop on my process. And these long hallways. And I don't know if, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands if you've ever been to Central Prison. I hope it was as a volunteer. But these long hallways that are about 20 foot long, and they're all concrete, but that floor looks like glass. It shines like glass. And you have to think about it. Why is that? And it's one place where men, the ones who are assigned to clean, they have all the time in the world, and they take a lot of pride in shining those floors. And you talk to some of the old timers that are there, and they all have their recipe about how to make those floors shine. And just the sounds and the clanging sounds. But there's a sight too that I'll never forget, and that's seeing the men in red jumpsuits. When you're on death row or you're sentenced to death in North Carolina, unlike the rest of the population where we wore brown, they wore a red jumpsuit that was just stood out, and you knew that they were life sentence people. And I never realized there's a couple of things that when I would look over at them in the what I refer to as a dining hall, I still don't call it a chow hall. Some prison lingo I didn't pick up on, but anyhow, you would sit across at them in their red jumpsuits, and they would be engaged in conversations, and someone would have smiles on their faces, and they would be talking about ball games. And I thought about how can they do that? You know, I'm looking at 10 years, they're looking at that's the end of their life. There's no opportunity there's no hope, there's no opportunity out there. Um, but just the resiliency that I did see in them. And I also noticed the huge difference in color of the men who are on death row. And I'll state at the end four key elements that I found. And there's an overwhelming representation of African Americans on there, and then Native Americans on there too. And so those early days, even in my sentence then at Central Prison, the seeds were beginning to be planted for what I could do when I did get out, even though I knew I had so much time left. I'll never forget the first day that I was able to go in the yard at Central Prison. It was about 4 days after my arrival at Central Prison. And keep in mind, when you're in the county jail in Johnston County, and it's no different in others, you're not allowed to go outside. You don't even see outside. And so I had not seen outside or felt the weather for those 20 months. And I remember walking out there, and it was in a string of those triple digit days like we know in North Carolina. And I walked out on the yard, and it's surrounded by walls of an old rock wall left from the original prison, and then these tall buildings that are now administrative buildings. And you know how when you go somewhere, you try to gravitate to somebody you know, whether it's a cocktail party or a restaurant, or you're going to church, you're going to go sit next to your friend there. And the only person I knew on that yard was a gentleman named Tony who had met in the county prison. And you're supposed to keep moving while you're on the yard. You're not supposed to sit still. And so I partnered up with Tony, and we were walking, and Tony had arrived about a week before I did, and he was one of the gentlemen that I would explain in regards to addictive behavior. He had actually killed his mother here in Johnston County over a fit of rage because of not being able to fund his source anymore and all. But just getting to know these faces and people one-on-one rather than just painted with a broad statistic. And when you put a face to it, it becomes reality. And that's part of what I'm trying to do now in my post-release work. And we'll get to that. But after 4 months there, I was then transported to a medium security prison called Johnston Correctional. And it's not far from where I'm at now. It's on Highway 70. And I used to ride by there a couple times a week. And I would think, you know, I can't believe they're out playing all day, or they get 3 meals a day and color TV. Why aren't they out cleaning up our highways and our byways? Why aren't they doing this? Little did I know when I was riding by with that kind of attitude and thought that I would end up spending 4 years of my life there. And the one thing about minimum security that was very helpful is you weren't contained for 23 hours a day. You had opportunity to go out on what's referred to as the yard, and you could go outside most all day long. You did have a job assignment. My first assignment was as a janitor. My second assignment was working in the clothes house, which was an incredible experience to get to know people. When you're folding laundry with somebody 8 hours a day, you get to know who's around that folding table. And the faces around the folding table, very few of them looked like me. They were not that old guy with gray hair. but I never had an issue with another inmate. I never had an issue with another inmate. And I found it quite interesting, some of the conversations I could engage in. But it was here that I really got to know the prison population. And one of the things that stands out is it came to clarity that there were many men who were incarcerated. If it had not been for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes of frustration or anger or addictive behavior, they never would have graced the prison walls or the prison gates. Oftentimes, it was a serious crime that resulted from that moment of rage. And I also learned that in conversation with some of the men, that no matter what they were known for, and oftentimes they were tagged with their crime, oh, that's the guy that did this, or you wouldn't believe what he did. How would anyone do that? Even amongst other prisoners, you're talking about this. One of the things that I came to value and really find was the conversations I would have. I came to realize that everybody had a place. Everybody had a seed where something could grow, something good could grow. And you don't know where how that conversation is going to start. It may be talking about something in their youth. It may be talking about playing Little League Baseball or a youth program they were involved in, or their mom or their child. There's somewhere you can get to where those barriers come down and it becomes a common ground, and there's some understanding that can be built. And I also learned about the mental health issues that we're facing. We're criminalizing folks sometimes with mental health issues that could be addressed other ways. And at Johnson Correctional, it was referred to as a medical camp, so they did give out the mental health drugs there. And some of the sites, one of the sites I'll never forget is when they would have count time, usually from 2:30 to 3, where you had to go to your bunk and be counted and accounted for. On a good day, it would clear by 3 o'clock and they would open the yard again, which was another medication line time. And it was like a stampede oftentimes for men running to that medical window to get their dose of whatever type of medication it was. And if only some of these resources had been available to the men before they got in there. And I'm not talking about real quality resources. I'm just talking about bare minimum resources within prison. But some of this incarceration could be reduced from that. But I stayed there for until the summer of 2015, and then I was transferred to Orange Correctional Facility, which is in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and that's where I would finish my prison sentence up. And it was a minimum security prison, which did not mean that there were not fence lines. There was Constantine wire. It was still prison. And many times people would say, oh, well, people like you, meaning myself with white collar crime, they're going to go to some country club prison. I'll say right now, North Carolina has no country club prisons. There are none out there. But I found myself in Hillsborough, which the advantages to a man or woman who makes minimum custody, and not everybody does, it's not just based on your time. You have to have 5 years or less left on your sentence before you can go to minimum custody. But you also have to stay out of trouble and be recommended and things like that. And I will say staying out of trouble in prison is very subjective to who's in charge. And that's what we're discovering on the streets of some of our over-policed areas and over-policed neighborhoods now. But I was fortunate enough to get there, and one of the things that is advantageous to minimum custody is there are more programs there. There's more volunteers coming in there for faith services, worship services, yoke fellows, which is like a visitation night there at the prison, and it's not simple to have happen, but it can happen, and good things can take place, and that's part of in that type of setting, in a minimum custody setting, that's where reentry processes become available. It's not where they should start. Reentry processes should start day 1 or 2 of your arrest. But that's where the reentry processes start, because you do engage with people from the community. You can sit down and have conversations with somebody who isn't also locked up. And I found value there. But in minimum custody, there's 3 levels. There's level 1, 2, and 3. Level 3 has the most privileges. So I arrived there as level 1, and I'll never forget when I met with my case manager the first time. And these case managers are overburdened. You'll find some really good ones, and then you'll find some really lousy ones in there. And the fact of the matter is, they're dealing with people's lives. So we need to improve upon that, and we need to get others involved in it, and folks with social services background and experience and things. But I'll never forget the first time I met with my case manager after arriving there. It was about 3 days later, and he asked me before we got finished, he said, "Mr. Hall, do you have any questions?" I said, "Yes. What does it take to get to level 2?" Because there was another privilege there. And at level 2, which I was able to obtain after being there for about 6 months, you're able to go out on a pass into the community with a volunteer who passes certain criteria. And my first visit outside of a prison after 7.5 years, it was an amazing experience. Um, I know I was taken back from it, and my wife was too, because she could see that we're getting to the end of this journey. But we went to McDonald's. My volunteer sponsor took me to McDonald's. We went into McDonald's. As an inmate, you leave the camp, leave the prison with a little BB&T debit card that the prison issues to you if you can purchase it. And they'll allow so much money on there. And so we went to McDonald's. We stood in line. It was really busy. It was the one there in Hillsborough. And so I got there, I looked up at the menu, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to order. First time I was going to be able to get something other than prison food. And so I was looking at the order, and I looked down at my hand and holding that debit card, and I was trying to figure out, okay, do I have enough money for this, and can I get a large sweet tea? That was one thing I wanted. And so I stood there in line, and then I got up, and the lady asked my order, and looked back up at the menu, and you know what happened? And it wasn't happening in 2008 and 9. The menu board changed. And I was so overwhelmed and so confused. And while that's something that now I can sort of laugh at and be amused at, think about the men who have been incarcerated for more than 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and just the little bit that we're doing behind prison walls for that reentry. And I don't even like the word reentry. I wish we had another word. Somebody mentioned the other day about reunification, because it is about getting somebody to a situation better than they were when they came in. If we're just going back and going to restore or reentry, we still have issues. But that was just a small thing. And, I was also able to progress from level 2 to level 3. And when you get to level 3, you're eligible for work release in the community. And at Orange Correctional, there's about 200 residents there. And there's usually only about 20 men who are on work release, even though there's many, many more who are eligible for it. And there's lots of challenges to it. Number one is finding an employer that wants to hire somebody, number one, with a criminal record, because they have a criminal record because of where they're going to be leaving from each morning. But also, we're not putting the pieces in place to allow people to correctly look for jobs. When you're in prison, you can't do an application online, which is how most employers are. And imagine this, imagine calling a small business owner in North Carolina and asking them, first off, you want to plead with them and ask them to please hire me. But you make that phone call, and I don't know if any of y'all have ever received a phone call from prison, but there's a recording that comes on first, and it says an inmate from Wake Correctional, Orange Correctional, wherever the facility is calling. Would you like to block the calls? Would you like to deny the calls? And imagine how that goes over in HR offices across North Carolina. It's a huge struggle, but it's an important program because it gives the men and women an opportunity to go into the community, to feel some value, to get integrated in there, to learn some real skills, and also to save some money where they can start with something when they get out. But I was fortunate enough to be able to get work release. I'm very thankful that I wrote a letter to the founders of the Durham Rescue Mission, Gail and Ernie Mills, and they got the letter, and through a sponsor, we organized a visit, and I went and visited it, and I don't think they exactly knew what to do with me when I first went there. Here's this guy coming from prison. They never had work release. They have a population on a daily basis of 450 to 500 men and women. Many of them have been justice involved in their life. And here's this guy who's in prison still, and he wants a job. And I shared with him this vision for what I refer to as vocational wellness. You know, we can teach a skill, we can teach computer skills, we can teach welding, we can teach some things, but if we're not taking care of the full wellness picture, such as their health care, getting them fresh glasses, getting their teeth taken care of, helping them learn how to get their driver's license even when they have a stack of things against them. And anyhow, I'm thankful to say they hired me. And I was fortunate those last 3 years to leave a place called prison every morning at 5 a.m. and go to a place called the Center for Hope. And I so enjoy it, and I continue to work there to this day. And with the work I'm doing now with Faceless No More that I'll talk about in the future or later in this presentation, it's important to teach about these issues. I want to teach people on both sides of prison fences, like this group we're talking to now, but I also need to stay close to it. I need to be close to those faces and those clients that we serve at the rescue mission, or the men that I serve through some other prison programs and things. But I'll go back to Orange Correctional. One of the things I'll never forget, because it was a camp where you would see men getting released from. And many times people were being released after 3 or 4 months of incarceration, sometimes decades of incarceration. There was one day shortly after I got there, there was a gentleman probably in his early 50s who was getting out after 30 years. And I'll never forget, because you can watch it, it's real close to the parking lot. Father pulls up to pick him up at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I'll never forget the scene. I would see him walk out, obviously to his father's loving arms, and he was probably in his 70s or 80s at that time. And this gentleman's brother had also been incarcerated. And the two brothers were involved in the same crime, but the other brother was sentenced to death and he was executed. And I just think about that father's heart with this joy of picking up one son, but never being able to pick up the other son. But I know we're getting pushed on time now, but there's so many slices to share about that journey and what took place, and the importance of programs and the importance of delivering quality product to our incarcerated population. There's things we need to do to keep people out of prison, but then also once they're in there, there's some things, and there's policy and procedure in place, but they're not being unfolded. They're not being allowed to happen. And I know security is always of main concern, but when you're limiting programs and quality programs to get men and women ready to go back into the community, you're raising that threat level with any community. But in concluding with my prison journey, I'll tell you there's 4 basic elements that I could talk about. And these are the influences of our justice system, and the influences on incarceration, and the influences on sentencing level. And one is politics. Politics plays a key role in it. And you can go back centuries, but you can also go back, to the mid 90s when we had this Get Tough on Crime law and Never in My Neighborhood laws came about. And there's incredible history behind that. The other is poverty. Poverty plays a big part in it. Yes, sometimes people say you'll get a crackerjack lawyer and he's going to get you out of there. And yes, sometimes that happens. And if you don't have the resources, and sometimes the resources isn't financial, sometimes the resources is a knowledge of how to make those contacts, how to contact the right legal representation, how to share that right conversation, how to put things on the table. If, like in my case, where I was guilty as the day was long, if you are that, how to address those things. But with poverty, oftentimes you don't have those relationships. And then race plays a huge part in it. Race plays a huge part in it. It plays a huge part in who's arrested, who's confronted on our streets with crimes. There's a wonderful lady who makes a presentation to one of my classes called We Are All Criminals. And we can all think back to times, or many of us can think back to times during our young years when maybe we did something that was illegal, that if we were of a different form or shape or color, it would have been taken off in a different way. Where maybe we were asked, oh, just get home safely tonight. We're not going to take you in. so race is. And then the fourth factor is the crime. I can never forget about the victims. And even in my case, I think about my victims. Yes, they were all made financially whole before I was even sentenced. And you would think, well, no harm, no foul, they got their money back. But in reality, the lasting victimization of my crime was my victim's ability to completely to trust that person again. And I often thought about their spouses or their children or their next advisor. Imagine the tough scrutiny that they went through. But those are the four elements. And in my post-release life, as Chris shared, I'm doing things I love educating and bringing speakers in, and we've had a host of speakers. Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevens' group out of Montgomery, Alabama, has been very supportive and has provided incredible speakers to us. Yesterday, we had Sister Helen Prejean, the subject of the book, Dead Men Walking, gave a presentation. We've had people from the mental health sector. It's just so many folks. And actually, a couple of weeks ago, we had a gentleman who called in from North Carolina death row to share with our class. And it's just so very impactful. And it puts the face on these statistics and stories. But I want to continue to do that. Next year is beginning to fill with being able to speak with faith groups, business groups, and I like doing that as a one-time workshop or a series of workshops. So if you have ideas, please let me know. Chris knows how to contact me as well. Even law students, I spoke to a group of law students the other day, and they spend so much of their interest and their time working on the homicide cases and learning about how to adjudicate a homicide case. But in reality, about 80% of the criminal records out there are misdemeanors. And we need to learn how to address those, because oftentimes when you're ensnared in that, it is so difficult to unwind it. And so those are part of the programs. Other programs I'm working on is programs within our jails to be able to take real high quality reentry type programs in there and teaching the skills that are needed. One skill, and one thing I found out in the last 10 years is this thing right here, the smartphone, has become America's pastime. And when you get out and they say, just do this on your phone, you can do this and do that, you have 10 years of rust on you, let alone decades of rust. But it's taking real quality programs in there. But at this time, I can see our time, we're beginning to draw short. But Chris and Mary, I would open it up to questions, and there's nothing that's off the table. I'm very comfortable with answering things, even in regards to the ugliness of my crime. So I welcome those.
We do have a few in chat. We have some remarks about how grateful they were that you shared your experience. Suzanne Botts wants to know about, would you comment on the inability to pay bail? Many people are innocent of a crime and are in jail.
Yes, and the North Carolina bail system has the ones that support it, the insurance industry, because bail is an insurance product regulated by the North Carolina Department of Insurance. They have a lot of strong financial interests in keeping bonds and bails in place. And there's many people, it doesn't matter if it is only a $500 bail that's put on their crime or a $10 million bail, they have no ability to meet that. They're not going to get out. And then, as I said earlier, we're keeping people incarcerated where they are no threat to themselves or others. Our police forces, our law enforcement forces they know how to track you down if you're not going to appear and you get a failure to appear. There's other charges that would compound upon that. But we need to really look at letting people, for especially these minor crimes, out on their own recognizance. And because what happens when you're sitting in there, let's say number one, let's say, for example, whether they're guilty or not guilty. Well, let me go back to the ones that they're not guilty. They've got to prove their innocence. And they're going to lose their job. It's hard to call an employer and say, well, I'm locked up, especially when they get that recorded phone call. They're probably not going to take a call and even hear the explanation. If you're paying child support, let's say you were paying child support and you were employed and you were meeting all those obligations. When you're not making money, you're not going to be able to pay that child support. So you get another compounded charge on top of that. We've got to address of what is the reason for bond. It should be to hold those who are dangerous to themselves or other people secure until the dust can settle and it can be adjudicated and we can find out how to move to the next step. But there is a large portion that just should not be sitting in there. And oftentimes people say, well, Mr. Hall, why didn't you bond out? You probably could have. And the fact of the matter with me, I knew I was going to have prison time. And I wanted to start those days counting toward my sentence.
Suzanne also asked whether if you're on work release, do you have to buy your own lunch?
Actually, it's interesting. I was fortunate enough to work at the Durham Rescue Mission, so they eat very well there, thanks to the volunteers and folks that are involved. But when you are on work release, it's first off, it's tough to get it, to secure a job from inside prison. But you pay a per diem. That's when I started paying a $20 per diem to the prison system. You have to pay that for 5 days a week, a maximum of $100 a week is what you're going to pay. If you end up working a 6-day-a-week job or 7-day-a-week job, which is what you want when you're in prison, you want to get out every day you can, you're going to pay $20. From Orange Correctional, I had to pay transportation as well. And the transportation charge was anywhere from $18 to $26. So in reality, it was $45 to $50 just getting out the gate in the morning. Think about this on work release. Many of the men who are on work release are making minimum wage. So you have these obligations. You're happy just to get out, but you have this indebtedness to the prison. And your check doesn't come to you. It goes, well, if some employers will give you a check, you have to turn it in when you get it. And it goes into an inmate trust account. Those charges are drawn out of it. Mine was directly deposited. So it can be, you won't work release. You won't work release. As far as lunch, when you leave, they give you what's called a pack out. And it's usually a sandwich and a soda and some crackers and things to eat. Oftentimes, the employers that do hire the men and women, they show a lot of mercy and grace, and they do help provide meals and things like that. And there's a whole nother issue when you use that debit card when you're out on work release, just like I explained mine on a pass, is scrutinized quite a bit. So you try to be very, very careful. But yes, you have to pay for you have to take your own meal and you pay a per diem.
Rod, do you have, there you go.
Yep. Mark, thank you again for just sharing your story here with us. And what you've shared is just really powerful. As you were talking about several policies, and I recognize that in North Carolina, for example, from my experience over the last couple of decades, we really, eviscerated the mental health system in our state, which has certainly led to more imprisonment and lack of treatment available, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, as you're thinking about next steps, and you've already described a lot of what you're doing already, and I think the education you're providing is certainly valuable. I'm wondering if you're thinking about advocacy and what role you might be able to play in actually advocating for policy changes that could move things forward.
Yes, and that's a good question. And I tell you, the mental health issues, you're right. We have just destroyed our North Carolina mental health system as it should be. And so many are being addressed from incarceration. I had a speaker at my OLLI class a couple of weeks ago, a lady named Elizabeth Kelly from the state of Washington, but she has a national practice representing men and women who have mental health issues and disabilities and developmental issues in the court system. And her message was powerful. But yes, I want to educate, but the advocacy comes from, and I'll tell you, it's not a mistake. It wasn't just a stroke of good luck that I chose the OLLI platform to go to. Let me give you an example. OLLI at Duke, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but they have approximately getting close to 3,000 members. And these are retired professionals, retired academics. They now also reach out to Duke alumni. The class that I'm doing now, we've had people we have someone from George Mason university attending, other universities. OLLI is at 124 universities across the country. And OLLI membership is made up of individuals 50 years old and older. Okay. So one of the reasons to educate this audience, and I'm so thankful for the platform they gave me. And my typical class is, it's not Mark Hall being the expert. I bring in the experts to talk about these different issues. And I just share a slice of my experience of why I feel these things are relevant. But the attractiveness of that audience, when you think about it, who can get the ear of the legislators and policymakers? Far better than a felon or somebody who works for an organization like, ACLU or Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's group, or the Council on Actual Innocence. We're all too close to it. First off, I'm a felon, so I'm discounted. They're too close to it because they already know these faces. But when you can educate the ones who can get the ear of the policymakers and the legislators and make common sense out of it, that's where the strong advocacy can come in. And we're beginning to see some of that in some small ways, where some of the OLLI members are getting the audiences with the folks that need to have a better understanding of it. The ones who can bring a bill or piece of legislation out there. So, Rod, that's one of the purposes behind the education, is helping people understand.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And my own experience with advocacy is that it actually takes, very little to actually, move legislators. As few as, 10 or 15 people reaching out on a topic will have them, pay attention to an issue. And so I really appreciate what you're doing, Mark.
Well, I appreciate your comments. So one thing is, it's almost like with myself completing that 5-year prison sentence, and I walk out, it's okay. It's now that I know, what am I going to do about it? And
Right.
I walked out very differently than many of my folks, men that I met incarcerated with, and who I think a lot about. I walked out with, I'm 62 years old. I had those relationships in place. It's not that immediate need to get shelter, to get my driver's license, to get a job. I had those things there, so I don't want to waste that opportunity now that I know. And that's kind of what I ask my students at the end. Now that I know, what are we going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And many of the speakers I have from different organizations, they put out like a call to action, things that they can do to participate.
Got it.
We are running out of time. I can see people have to go. We have 2 more questions, and I think I'm going to make sure that you get those questions, and you can email me the answers if you don't mind, Mark.
Thank you, Chris.
And Mark, I want to tell you that, like all your classes, this has been amazing, and I've seen lots of people shaking their head and a few tears, which is normal with your classes. And we will welcome you back, I'm sure. I love it.
Thank you. I want to mention one thing about that, Chris. The emotions of these classes erupt, and it's even with the work there at the rescue mission. If I get through the day, or I get through a class or a day at the mission without that emotional moment, it's only because I'm just not paying attention.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
I can understand that, yes. And Mary, are you, I guess Marie, you have the